This is Art History 1, Part 9, Byzantine Art. This is a map of the Byzantine Empire, and the empire is a continuation of the Roman Empire. In fact, the people who lived in this empire thought of themselves as a continuation of the Roman Empire. They called themselves Romans. But at this point, 555, this is during the time of Justinian, this was at its largest extent. By this time, what we would think of as the Roman Empire had already fallen, like in the 400s. And so all of this area that used to be the Roman Empire, most of Western Europe was no longer controlled at all by the continuation of the empire called the Eastern Empire. What started it was when Constantine became emperor in the 300s, he moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople, and by doing this, it sort of changed the center of gravity of the empire, so that what used to be basically a Latin civilization became more of a Greek civilization. The Latins at the time of the imperial Rome, the Greekness of them was more of a superficial thing, whereas the Latin, they were essentially Latins, and most of their ideology, their laws, and their history was from the Roman civilization. When it moved to Constantinople, it was more the other way around. It was more basically Greek, with more of a surface of Latin to them, and in fact, eventually they dropped Latin, and Greek became the official language. And the church, which had begun in Rome and had the Pope being in Rome, changed its character too, so that what the church as it existed in the East became the Greek Orthodox Church, which is very different from the Catholic Church, and it still exists in the East. So what we're going to look at is over the course of this civilization, which, thinking of it as beginning with Constantine's move, existed all the way up until the 1400s, when they were eventually conquered by the Muslims, the Ottoman Turks, and in 1453, I believe it was, and in all of that time, I mean, over 1,000 years, it existed, and its fortunes, waxed and waned, and at some points they would lose ground, and then other times they would gain it, and there were times when they were tried to recover, tried to bring back the old empire, and sometimes they would change. There was a period of iconoclasm, which changed the character some, and then that was changed back. So what we're going to look at is just a few works to represent the entire period. The first thing we're going to look at is architecture, and it's the Hagia Sophia, which is the Church of Holy Wisdom in Constantinople. In order to understand what's going on here, it's very complex. What we're looking at is the inside of a Christian church that has been turned into a mosque by the Muslims in the 1400s, and since then it has undergone this change. It for a long time it acted as a mosque. I think it's currently a museum, and so it still has many of the trappings that it had as a mosque, but it also, at one time, most of the gold mosaics had been whitewashed, and they have been cleaned off, and so we can see sort of what it looked like, but it's a very busy thing, and it doesn't fit the normal church shape. So it's difficult to see what's going on. So in order to understand the building, we need to review the arch. This is an arch, and made up of two vertical elements and the voussoirs, or the wedge-shaped blocks. If you were to make such an arch like this, it would have to be supported as you put these blocks in, and the force of gravity pushes down on it or pulls down from it, and because of these wedge shapes, the there's nowhere for the wedge to go. It just pushes on the ones on either side, and that push is relayed to this push and down here, and it's the force of it is diverted from this direction down to here. But because of all those different angles of force, they average out into a force that's moving kind of laterally this way and laterally this way. And if you were to make such an arch out of stone and remove the supports, it would fall like this. Because of that push, and because all those wedges are pushing out that way, and that's what that force is doing. You could stop that force with another arch on either side like this, where the two forces counteracted each other, or cancel each other out, so that this is perfectly stable. But eventually, at some point, you have to stop and reinforce. So if you were to have an arch and to make it stable, you have to put more weight out here. You have to have a mass out here that will counter the thrust that's going off to the side. Similarly, if you have a dome is essentially a bunch of arches. If you were to take an arch and rotate it about its vertical axis 360 degrees, you would have a dome, and each one of these arches would have the same problem that a single arch has. That is, its thrust is moving out all directions. So if you make a dome like this, you're going to have you have to have a whole lot of mass out here to keep it up. But you can divert it. If you put an arch here underneath the dome, you can the weight of the dome can push down on the arch, and that will redirect, I guess, the forces down to here. So if you have a lot of mass here, this will counteract the force of the dome. But you have a problem right here. What do you do with this space? How do you make this space hold up what's above it? Well, the folks in Constantinople during the time of Justinian worked on this problem. There were some engineers and people very familiar with geometry came up with this plan. Suppose you have a cube, and inside the cube you have a sphere. And if you were to take away the shape of the sphere from the inside of the cube like this, you have this shape here. This is a sort of a triangular shape, and it's concave, and it's something that if you were to put weight here, or here, or here, it will redirect that weight and push it down towards these legs here like this. And this shape is called the pendentive. You can see a pendentive in the Hagia Sophia, this shape. It's kind of a roundish triangle with round sides, and it is concave, and it is the shape of a sphere. That is, a sphere inside this building would touch this plane that you see here, this area right here. And what's going on is all the weight of this dome is pushing on this arch, and that is being redirected down to here, and this is being redirected down to here, so that in the corners is where it's all going. And if we look at the plan, the corners is where all the mass of this building is to hold up the dome. And that's a remarkable thing. This is a very large building, so this amount of mass inside the building it apparently is enough to hold up this dome. And it was designed in such a way that you don't get the sense of it. When you're in the building, you're looking around, you can't see what's going on because that mass is sort of hidden behind this corner here. You have this wall, which is one of the areas underneath the arch that is filled with a wall, but it has windows in it, and it has colonnade insides with all this space. You're given the impression that these columns are holding up the dome, but you could take this whole wall out and the dome would still stand up because none of the weight of the dome is being pushed onto this wall. It's all redirected. And this arch over here, it just has air under it. The air is not holding up anything. There's another space out here. If we look back at the plan, This is the main dome area, and then there's two half domes on either side. And then there's smaller domes on these sides. So what's going on is kind of like misdirection. Everything is not as it seems. And topping it all off, you have this the feat of cutting holes in the bottom of the dome like this, where you need to have all the support, where you need to be able to hold up all of this weight. They've cut all these holes. But if you notice, the shape of the holes are arches. And those arches are redirecting the force that's hitting them and redirecting on either side. Now, it looks as though the dome is that thick. It's not particularly thick right there. But if we look at it from the outside, this is the outside. The windows are much bigger on the outside, and the inner side is a much smaller thing. And light comes in through these lattice-covered openings and makes it so that you can have more mass between the windows than it is being appeared from the inside, because these these like little tunnels that go through. So there's a whole lot of mass. We look back over here, we can see this mass here is has a big hole on the outside and a smaller hole on the inside for that light to come in. But the effect that it has is kind of magical, because when you look at it in the normal darkness that is in the building, this light coming in from underneath the dome makes it look as though the dome is floating. So you're in a kind of an otherworldly space with the walls covered with mosaics, and the mosaics have gold in them, so that any light on the inside is reflected off the gold and sparkling. And you have all of these wonderful surfaces in different textures, and loggias and columns, and in unexpected spaces, so that you're dealing with something. You just come in and you're just dazzled by all of the stuff inside, and the fact that everything seems to be floating, and there's this enormous space that seems to be held up magically. So that's the effect that they're going for when they're making a church in such a way that is to make it the city of God. That the experience of going in is like like you're going into heaven, or like you're going into another worldly place, a spiritual place. So they're using architectural design and engineering to take away the expectations, what you would think should be the shapes inside of a building, in order to give you that experience. Let's look back at the ground plan here. We looked before at basilicas, and basilicas have a longitudinal axis for processions down the middle, and it has an apse at one end, like this does. And it also has, colonnades on either side. So this would be comparable to the nave, called the naos here in the east. But and all these other rooms are like the aisles in a basilica. So it's kind of like a basilica, only very strange, only a very very modified in a different way. This you can imagine that the engineers started with the idea of squares inside circles like this, and spheres inside cubes, so that that geometry that creates the shapes of the thing are the governing plan of it, rather than making it like a basilica. But they still needed to have this longitudinal axis, and normally if you're going to have a square inside a sphere, or a sphere inside a square, you're going to have something that's radially symmetrical. So putting a half circle here and a half circle here, make it longer than it is wide. And also by filling in the arch on this side and this side with a loggia, as we see here, makes a wall on this side, a wall on this side, and an open space on this side, so as to make it, longer than it is wide. So as you can have the liturgy and all the processional things that occur in the Christian church. Altogether, a very remarkable thing. It looks kind of like, on the outside, like mountains. like a mountain with lots of hills and stuff rising up. These minarets were added later. You can imagine that it would just look like a mountain without the minarets. Okay, so that's our first bit of architecture, and the second work that we have is going to be inside a building. This is San Vitale in Ravenna. We look real quick back to the map. Ravenna is here at some point, I guess 555, when Justinian was the emperor. He moved the capital, or used Ravenna as the capital for the western part of his empire. I think Rome had declined a lot. And he built a church there at a place called San Ravenna. And Justinian, this is a similar sort of thing in that it has a dome and it's on pendentives, and but it's much smaller and not nearly as complex. It has a kind of odd shapes coming in and out everywhere, like Santa Sophia or Hagia Sophia has. And inside, it does have that sort of oddness to it. It's a radially symmetrical church with an apse, and the little extended, I think, choir area here. We're going to be looking at mosaics that are here to give you a sense of what the art in the Byzantine period is like. Usually, it's much different than in the classical art of the Roman Empire. This is a photograph taken inside the church, probably with a big light setup, big flash, so as you can see all of the stuff. But the actual experience of being inside is more like this. It's dark. The light you see comes in from windows. But even this doesn't capture what's going on with the gold. Inside the surfaces of the inside, it has lots of colored marbles and things, but it also has mosaics made out of these little squares of glass, and then sandwiched between two pieces of glass would be gold leaf, and that gold leaf would reflect light like a mirror, and since each one is not particularly exactly parallel to or coplanar with everyone else, what happens is that as lights, like from candles or light from windows, they sparkle on it, so everything glitters as you walk around and look at all the things inside. So it would be a very special kind of place to be inside one of these things. The work that we're going to be looking at is just one of the panels, or there's two of them, one on either side of the apse, and they represent Justinian and his wife. His wife is on the opposite side. There she is. And you can see that they make a rectangle out of patterns on the wall, out of these mosaic pieces, and you can see that it has a little curve to it. This is where the apse starts. It just curves around and makes a semicircle back here. So this is round back there, and so this is what the rectangular wall kind of starts to curve right there. That's why the picture looks like this. But anyway, the style is so vastly different than what we've seen before from the Roman Empire. Imperial Rome we saw earlier on in the Ara Pacis, where you had a relief sculpture, and everything about it was very classical in terms of the poses, the proportions of figures, the realism, and all that. All those things that we think of as classicism. But here, there's a complete rejection of it, similar to what we saw with the Tetrarch style, where there was a complete rejection of what was classical. But this is a two-dimensional work rather than three dimensions, and the illusion of space is very weak. When you look at these figures, there's a whole bunch of figures with a row of heads, a bunch of bodies, and a bunch of feet at the bottom, and very little attention has been made to try to make these look real flesh and blood people with contrapposto pose and drapery that falls naturally. What's going on? That you have something that looks more like paper dolls, people who are completely flat. They are in a space that is not represented as space at all. It's just a background color of gold, and it's hard to photograph gold for one thing. It just sort of looks yellowish brown. But if you were to see this in person, any light that you saw would be sparkling off of this, and this would be very shiny and golden. But there's no indication that there's no shadows. There's nothing to make you think that the artist is even conceiving these people as spatial things, as even three-dimensional things. Here's a place where a foot is on top of another foot, and is it in front of or behind? The feet aren't even planted on the ground; they're just sort of dangling, and so that dangling gives you the impression that it doesn't have any weight at all. And also, when you look at the way the tonality, the way modeling occurs on the surface of things that should be round, like drapery folds as they come out and go in, the convex, and concavities. You expect light to hit it in certain ways and to make light and dark shadows, but they're not applied consistently. You see some dark and you see some light, but there's no, they're not trying to make it look three-dimensional or round. They're just making patterns, and that's the takeaway on this, is that everything is a pattern. Everything is decorative. They used any number of colors and patterns that look like architecture stuff, like dentils up here, but also like jewelry, like the kind of jewelry when they want to decorate something with jewels, like the cover of a book. This is a gospel book that a person is holding, and it's got little circles on it to indicate pearls or jewels of some sort that are decorating the book. Everything is just a matter of decoration. We look at the one that's on our list, the one of Theodora on the other side. I mean, she's covered in jewels. Little circular bits of marble, white marble or something, that give you the impression that she's she just is lavishly decorated with jewels. Here's a close-up of her. I guess these are earrings, probably sapphires or something like that, and pearls. So you get the sense that the artist is more interested in decorative patterns than in any kind of realism. So we're very, very far removed from classicism. And if you look closely, you'll see that the way the eye is rendered, with this almond shape and the repeated arc up here and then another arc for the eyebrow, that's like the Tetrarch style we saw in the later phase of the Roman Empire. You can see instances of that in everybody. They all have that kind of eyes. In fact, they all seem to be of the same facial type, with just a few indications of individuality. I think this is one of his generals, so he has a mustache. So this is what that guy looked like, and this is what Justinian looked like. A little bit of slightly different eyebrows or something, but otherwise it's the same facial type over and over. Maximianus is the priest in the place. So there's the retinue of the priest on one side, and the retinue of the emperor on the other side, with his soldiers back here. Everything is an opportunity to bring color and patterns, and it's all based on the surface. Look at this. I guess this would be an architectural element, a capital with a pilaster, say, flutes that are. Everything is made out of the kind of stuff you would put on treasure, to make it all expensive looking, with jewelry and gold and stuff. Look at the patterns on the outside of Theodorus. There's all sorts of stuff going up here. Just changes of color, changes of texture. There's a classical egg and dark motif making a pattern there. Here's another one over here. This in and out thing with the little flowers, the little checkers things going on. So it's all about the prettiness, the decorativeness, and not about classicism. We've gone a long way from classicism, but there are some things that you could say are classical. That is the fact that they're wearing sort of toga-like clothes, and that an attempt has been made to make drapery look kind of like drapery, like this. She's got her arms up to hold something, and the way the cloth responds to that is a pattern, but it's sort of like the way drapery works. So whoever made this is sort of had inherited something from the classical tradition, but it's gone through this change to make it into what I would call the Byzantine style. The emphasis on pattern, doll-like figures, no weight, and color and prettiness and decorative. There are some elements here, like this seashell sort of thing. It's a recession in the wall with a kind of a quarter dome that's made to look like a seashell. That comes from the Romans. They would have stuff like that in their architecture. And this is being used in this place to emphasize that this is Theodora and she's special. She even has a halo. There is an indication of space in the sense of a room, say, beyond, or maybe this is going outside, that they're all sort of moving in that direction, but they're moving across the picture plane to a rectangle that is parallel to the picture plane. And there's this sort of illusionistic curtain that's sort of knotted up here, actually very well rendered, comparatively speaking, than other things. The kind of looks a little bit illusionistic, but overall everything is as flat in pattern as it can be. Here's another little close-up. You can see what the little bits of each one of these is called a tessera, and the plural is tesserae. They have little different colored stones, different colored marbles. There may be some ceramics, some glaze or something in there as well. Okay, so as the empire continued, things would change, and what we're going to see is that everything made in this period is going to be some sort of blend between classicism and the Byzantine style, or some sort of derivation of that Tetrarch style. And this, initially, when you look at this, is a representation of the Archangel Michael, and it seems, on first appearance, to be very much classical. When you compare this to the other ivory that we saw earlier, the one that was made in around 400 AD, the one of the priestess and something that was wholly classical. At least it was something that it was a pagan thing made even after the Roman Empire had turned Christian. That there were still artists who could make classical things, or things in the classical style. This sort of looks like that. It's an ivory. It's got a figure that's standing, and there's drapery, and the drapery looks, naturalistic to a large extent. And it's an architectural space, and architecture is recognizable as classical architecture with columns that are fluted, and let's see, Corinthian capitals, and all this stuff. Every one of these patterns that you see came from classical antiquity. But when you start looking at them, you can see that the artist is taking advantage of the fact that this is ivory, and by being ivory, you can cut things with lots of precision, very small details that you couldn't do if this were wood. He's loaded it with these patterns. I mean, there's a variety of patterns. There's the bead and reel here. There's acanthus leaves. Each acanthus leaves has all its little grooves and stuff to make it, flow around its shape the way it's supposed to do it. And there's little doodads up here, and the rosettes, and with this little laurel wreath kind of thing with a cross and an orb, symbolizing, the Christianity. But it's inside of a seashell motif that comes from classical antiquity. This is a ribbon. Look at that ribbon and all the little kinks and folds of it going on. That's dentils down here. It's just like the guy couldn't resist putting as many bits and bobs of decoration everywhere. So emphasis on pattern as indicator of Byzantine style is evident everywhere. The feathers in the wings here. Look at each one. Each one has veins, and there's a lot of variety in it, as if the artist had looked at actual wings of birds in order to get this as accurate as he could. And the hair, making it a curly-haired person rather than just some solid-shaped hair person. We can see these eyes are very much like the beady, starey, wide-eyed look from the Tetrarch period. But but otherwise, it was very classical. This is a very classical mouth. The shape here is very classical. Um, the hand, the naturalism within the hand, there's more patterns. The kind of rendering of drapery is very elaborate. I mean, it's got all sorts of stuff, and it seems to be naturalistic to the point of, you can see the figure under, you see his knee, you see where his thigh is, but also you have all these folds, and the folds are irregular, like these things that go like this. It looks like the artist has looked at something, if not actual drapery, a representation of drapery that was as natural. I mean, look at that little passage right there is very nice in terms of its dependence on the classical style. But when I look at something like this looks a little artificial. This looks a little stylized, and it kind of reminds me of, well, let's look back at the Tetrarchs. They have this kind of thing going on too. So it isn't wholly classical, and it's now that you start looking at all the details, it starts to become much more Byzantine, though Byzantine with an intention of looking as classical as possible. Here's something odd. Look at the heels seem to be planted on the top step of a bunch of stairs, and they planted in such a way as if the artist is meaning that the body has weight, and it's putting weight on that heel. But then the foot sort of dangles down again, sort of like the feet in the Justinian's work, the most mosaic we were just on. Like it sort of dangles down, and it dangles down over 3 steps. If these are steps, then he's way back in the back. But when we look at the rest of him, he's in the front. So this sort of spatial ambiguity, I guess what you could call this, or somebody who's not interested in representing rational space. Now, one of the things, we didn't see a lot of this, but one of the things that characterized two-dimensional representation of space in Roman and even in Greek painting was that there's a rational space where things work the way they ought to. If you remember, say, the mosaic with Alexander and Darius, the way the horses were rendered, in the 3/4 view, and you can see them, that they are planted feet on the ground, and that they are in a convincing space. But this, when you think of convincing space, well, it's kind of weird for his feet to be here, and for his wings to be here, if this is a real space. But of course, in the Byzantine art, it would be perfectly normal, as we just saw back here. They don't care that much about space at all. So if an artist who's used to this sort of thing wants to do something that looks classical, you could forgive him for doing this if he could also get all these other things right. So the takeaway on this sort of thing, and in most of these works, is that there's going to be some classical aspect, and there's going to be some Byzantine aspect, and that's how these things are characterized. And how much of one or the other just depends on when it was made and what whether or not they want to be, I guess from their point of view, old-fashioned and be classical, or if they want to be the new modern Byzantine look. The next work is it's called Virgin and Child Enthroned. It's in the monastery of St. Catherine. It's a painting. It's what do you call it? A tempera painting, egg tempera, where they mix powdered pigments with egg and water, and that egg, when it dries, it becomes a solid thing that will last a long time and keep the colors. This is the type of painting that was used all the way through the Middle Ages most of the time, and up into, say, the early 1400s, where oil painting was introduced. And once it was introduced, very few artists ever went back to this medium. But while they did it, They would make these paintings on wooden panels. They would cover them with gesso, which is kind of a calcium carbonate with mixed with kind of a gelatin that comes from boiling animal parts to get the collagen from it. So anyway, here's a representation of the Virgin Mary sitting on a throne, surrounded by saints and angels. And this will be a type of picture that we'll see many times, and especially when we get to the Renaissance, there will be lots and lots of these. This is a Byzantine version. And so in this version, what we see is that the artist has like one foot in the classical realm and one other foot in the Byzantine realm. So let's look at the Byzantine things first. This figure. This looks a lot like one of those figures in the Justinian mosaic that we saw before. Even the sort of the facial features. Let's look up close. The same sort of facial features. The eyes, big wide staring eyes, a cap of hair, doll-like proportions. This is kind of like a paper doll. And he's relatively flat. His feet are dangling. His surface is covered with patterns. And those patterns don't seem are not showing, indicating the form underneath. You can imagine if cloth had a pattern printed on it, and you made it go around something, that pattern would also go around it. But here the pattern is flat, just as it is over here. There's very little indication that these have any volume, except for a little bit of tone right here, a little darker tone here, a little darker tone here, and a little bit here, the shadow. In fact, looking at the placement of this is about where his knee would be. And if his knee is like that, it must be sort of poking out. And if this one's straight, then it may be that underneath this tunic or robe, whatever he's wearing, there's a contrapposto pose in there. And if so, that would be a classical element. But if it is, it's sort of it's like a distant echo of one. It's not like the artist is thinking in terms of the figure underneath it. It just may be the style that he does. You take this knee and you put a little shadow there, and that's just something you do. Even over here, there's a little bit of it here. But here you don't see it as part of a pose at all. It's just part of the surface decoration and nothing to do with the figure underneath. Maybe the artist wasn't even aware that was what that was for, because it's so far removed from the classical style. There is something what appears to be shadows here, which, if it is kind of makes it look like the feet are on the ground. But when I look at this one, it looks more like the feet are dangling. The figure of Mary, though, let's look at her. Her drapery, when you look at this doesn't look nearly as stylized, and it looks like it's moving the way drapery actually moves. Especially this is very convincing. So if I were grading this in terms of classicism versus Byzantine, I would say, well, this is rather classical. This requires some looking at cloth, or at least looking at some other work of art where the cloth was painted by somebody who had looked at cloth. The proportions of the infant Christ is also kind of baby-like. It looked like someone's actually at some point looked at a baby and seen the proportions. So that bit is very classical. Otherwise, the face is very Byzantine, and the eyes, tetrarch kind of eyes back there. The fact that the halos are flat against the background. That was the normal way of doing halos from the beginning of halos all the way until, say, in the 1400s, when the Italian Renaissance happened, and they saw halos differently. They saw them, instead of being discs behind your head, flat against the background, they became sort of frisbee kind of things attached to the back of your head that moved with your head. And that was an innovation in spatial relationships that's going to happen in the future. But at this point, it's just a surface thing, just like the patterns on the cloth. It's just surface decoration. Then we get up here to the angels. The angels are different. They're rendered differently than these. These are types. These are sort of things that the artist making these could have looked at any other picture to find reference for how to do a face, how to do a pattern, how do you do any of these other parts, and how to do feet. All this stuff came from something else. It could easily, but these angels, I think in order to do this, a person would have to actually look at a person to see how their muscles work. Like this muscle that's in a person's neck. When you turn your head like that, that becomes more prominent. So someone is actually looking at anatomy a little bit, and the way the tonality of this face is much more convincing than these. This looks like a stylization kind of modeling, whereas this looks like modeling that comes from someone looking. Look at there's light on the left side here, and it's coming from the left on over here, and the shadows are different, so that the artist must have had a model and saw, okay, this one's going to be on the left, so this is the way the head turns this way, and this is the way the head turns this way, and so that's looking at something in real life in nature to render it is something you think of as a classical thing rather than a Byzantine thing. But here we are in the Byzantine Empire with someone doing that. This is the hand of God coming down to bless Mary and Jesus, and this is a beam of light. I believe this is the angel's wings back here. Like I could also mention the thing about the halos is the idea of halos come from the time when Moses came down from Mount Sinai and he had light shining from his face, and that idea of someone who's been with God and is blessed by God is that they're shining, that they're glowing kind of from their face, is something that you can understand intellectually, but actually having to render it, if you're rendering in a style that is non-representational, something that is stylized, then you have to have a symbol for it rather than making it look illusionistic. So that's where the idea of the halo is just being a symbol of a person who is holy, and it goes to anybody, not just Moses. And because this is a style where everything is flat and patterned, and a perfect circle where you get a compass and you draw a circle behind somebody's head, that became the norm. And so having people with halos sort of puts everything in the realm of flatness, even when you do some bits that are classical. Notice that these heads of the angels, they're tilted over to the right. This one's go over to the left. So the head is able to move in space, but not the halo. It's not until much later, hundreds and hundreds of years later, before anyone decided to make halos change their shape as a person changes position of their head. Okay, here's the next work. This is much later. This is in the 1100s, still in the Byzantine Empire. And they're still using this style that we saw back in Justinian's time, in the 500s, where you have these look like cutout figures with a stylization of drapery against a gold background is still the norm. So even if on occasion they would dabble with classical things, they would always come back to this, and this is the standard. This is what you expect for most of the time. This is an architectural thing, so it's much bigger. I think these are life-size figures, and so it's more monumental, but still. Let's look at the way the figure looks. All the other figures that we've seen were draped, and so we have a semi-nude figure. This is a Christ on the cross, and you get to see how they render anatomy. So when you look at this, you see first the body has an S curve, and this sort of curve, which is kind of an artificial thing. And this is a standard way of representing Christ on the cross, is to have this sway. Every one of them will have it. Also, when you render the musculature, there's a little bit of naturalism here in terms of there's a little bit darker here than up here, so you've got some modeling. But the way the muscles are stylized, the pectoral muscles have a line to indicate the edge of it. There's a little bit of tonality to show this is a convex shape. But then when you look down at the musculature of the abdomen, the abdominal muscles here, they are rendered with the tonality indicating the shade at the tops and the highlights at the bottoms. which seems to go reverse from what we would expect if these are convexities of the surface. And also there's a hard edge around here, which in normal people there would be a subtle gradation between one and the other, so that you can see that this is also a stylization. And this is a kind of stylization that is going to be repeated endlessly in all crucifixes, whether they're mosaics or painted with tempera paint. It's just a thing that they do, because what the artists are doing, who make these, is that, you know, if you have to do a crucifix, you don't go look at an actual person to see what they look like. You look at a work of art that was already made in the past, and the one that you're looking at is made by somebody who themselves were looking at a work from the past. So generation after generation of these stylizations are maintained, you know, without anyone ever looking to see what anatomy looks like. There's also the blood and the water coming from the wound in Christ's side, and also from the wounds in the hands here. There's a red stripe and a white stripe indicating the blood and water, and it's made in such a obviously symbolic manner rather than a naturalistic manner. The faces of Mary and John are stylized, you know, and they're almost like the same face, and it's endlessly repeated. Remember the stylization of the folds of cloth like we saw before in that Archangel Michael. You see it again here. And this kind of thing, this stylization where the kinks, I guess you could say, of the cloth as they turn corners into sharp corners. This kind of thing is also seen endlessly over and over in many instances in Byzantine art, all the way up until you get to the Renaissance. And one of the things we will see when we get there, that they will think of this kind of art in the restaurant in the Renaissance as the Greek manner, they would call it, and that's because when anything that came from the Byzantines is essentially Greek. Again, let's notice the fact that there's no space. There's no the background is entirely gold, and the indication of where Golgotha, with the place of the skull, is just as it would be in, say, a play with a very shallow stage, so as to not have any spatial awareness or any indication that these things are happening in space. But what it is happening in is a spiritual realm, a realm that has gold in the background is not a real world thing. And so having figures that are stylized with stylized drapery and all these other things that I'm talking about are a way to remove them from the regular world. That when you're in a church and you're looking at the religious personages, what you're looking at are spiritual things. That it's deliberately removed from the real world. And similarly, when we look back at the Tetrarchs, when they were rendered the way they were, it was to remove them from the regular world. You know, they didn't want them to look like the Tetrarchs, to look like real people. They wanted them for propaganda purposes, to make it look as if the emperors were like another kind of human being, something that is a Superman kind of person who's you know, above and beyond what the regular world. So you could see the Christians adapting this to their own style, because when they made their works, they wanted to remove them from the real world. Part of it had to do with you know, a desire for these things to not look real in the same sense. They didn't want to be copying the Romans, the earlier Romans, the imperial Romans, who had idols, and they wanted to distance themselves from that. But on occasion, and especially this occasion, this is much also later. This is in the 1100s. This is a Psalter, which is a book of Psalms. It is a book that's made by hand, where you get vellum and you put a whole bunch of sheets of vellum and bind them together in the book, and you write down all the Psalms, and I believe it also has commentaries and prayers and things. It's a book that you can use, a Christian can use for devotional purposes. But it also has pictures. And here, you look at this picture and you say, well, wow, we're in a completely different world from where we were before. This doesn't look Byzantine at all. It looks like something that is as close as you can imagine what something in the Roman Empire would look like, or even what the Greeks would look like. All the shapes are modeled as three-dimensional. Even the poses, like this is David playing a harp or a musical instrument, composing the Psalms, and he's seated on something, or like a rock or something. But look at his pose. He's not presented frontally like what we've been seeing, but he's seated sort of. We see a three-quarter view with a leg sticking out here, another one leg sticking over here, and you can see that the feet are on the ground and foreshortened properly. Everything is made as if we're suddenly back in the Roman Empire. There's a figure back here who's seated also on the same thing, but over to the left and facing a different direction and twisting around in space. Her arm is up here propped against David's back. She's a representation of a muse, and it says right here, Melody is her name. And so the idea of a muse inspiring someone to do a creative act is definitely from the classical period. It's a Greek thing. It's also written in Greek. And so whoever's doing this is, wants to show David and writing the Psalms, but he wants to do it as if it were represented by a Greek or a Roman, in their style, and in using, I guess, what you call iconography, or an image system, the way they would. We're having muses here, a symbol here. This figure here is a symbol of this river, the river Bethlehem, as it says down here in Greek. There's a river, and it has a river god who is representing the river, but is represented by a naturalistic human being in a complex pose. Look at this pose, where you see, the leg on this side is coming back and the toe curling around on this side, so you can see complex spatial relationships going on in a complex pose that looks like it came from a statue of some kind. Again there. And then, to top it off, you have a background where you can see a distant city, and that distant city is rendered as being lighter and bluer than the rest of the picture, which is what we would call later atmospheric perspective, something to indicate that some things are far away. And that's something from nature. So where are they getting this? How were they able to make something so naturalistic, something that looked like it could have been made in the Italian Renaissance some hundreds of years later? Well, they must have had access to imagery of some kind from the Roman Empire, from the imperial period, or they may even have something from the Greeks, because most everything in here looks convincingly presented in a rational space, and even the face of David here. This is a classical face. This is not the Tetrarch face at all. In fact, nothing in here looks like it's from the Tetrarch style, or what I'm calling the Byzantine style, except maybe the way this drapery is stylized a little bit. Yes, this would be something that is consistent with them. Otherwise, everything else, well, I guess the weirdness of the animals, I guess, is a little bit Byzantine. But mostly, this looks classical in every way. I have a few other pictures of this from the same Psalter. You can see some things like this drapery, the way this stylizations of this drapery kind of harken back to something like this kind of drapery. So it's not 100% classical in every bit of it. But I mean, look at this. This is the seat that he's on. This is it looks like isometric projection or something, where you see a facet going back into space. We're reminded of the kind of architecture you saw in the and the Pompeian wall mural that we saw before in the House of the Verii. Another page from the same thing where you can see figures. They look like classical figures moving in space, doing action, almost like a Greek Hellenistic sculpture. So they were perfectly able, or at least this artist was perfectly able to render the ancient look, even at a time when other art at the time, would look like this. So it's a complex period. As I said before, often everything has a blend between two things. Something like the David Psalter seems to be largely classical, and this work seems to be largely Byzantine. In fact, there's hardly anything about this that you could say is classical. This is an icon. It's called the Virgin of Saint Vladimir, and it's a famous one because it was painted. I think in the 1100s, but it was it had a famous history where it was said to that it would protect the city that it was in, and so it was taken from one city to another because people kept capturing it and wanted to use it to protect their city. But anyway, this is representative of many of these icons that were made for small devotional objects used for Christian devotion, where you would put this on an altar between your home in some sort of special place, maybe light some candles, and you would have prayers, and it would be the sort of thing that it sort of puts you in that spiritual mood that was necessary. And though this one is very old and I guess it's been through a lot, you can still see much of it. The Byzantine aspect would be the fact that it looks like a cutout. It looks like it's very flat. The parts that do have volume, say the baby, is stylized in a certain way that we've seen before. Is made of, it has gold leaf with paint on top of the gold leaf to create these patterns that look very decorative. Look at the shape of the neck for the Christ child. It doesn't look like whoever made this had ever seen what humans look like. This face that you see with the long skinny nose like this, I have another picture you can see a little better. A long skinny nose. This is a facial type that became a standard, and once it became a standard, I mean, all of these faces of Mary look just alike, and they have a certain kind of modeling for the face, and oftentimes the modeling of the face is out of key with the rest of the picture because everything else is relatively flat or largely flat. The fact that the infant Christ is cheek to cheek with the mom is one of the types that they use for a Madonna child. But they would have other ones as well. And sometimes Christ would be sitting holding something that is representation of the Eucharist or something representation of or symbolic of his future death. But they all have this sort of intimate relationship between mother and child, and there's a tiny bit of naturalism, like an arm coming out of here, where the Christ's arm must be around the neck, but it's in an unbelievable spatial way. In fact, there's no indication that the artist is aware of space. In fact, or is even concerned at all about making these things look like people or the way objects look in space, but rather look like otherworldly objects, like removing these people, these Mary and Christ, and on occasions when they're saints or angels, to remove them from the real world, where things that are recognizable as being in a rational space, but rather in a flat decorative pattern to look kind of like a treasure object.